Welcome to Ring of Fire. I'm Farron Cousins sitting in for Mike Papantonio. Here's what's coming up on today's show. The progressive movement has been relatively silent about Attorney General nominee Loretta Lynch's ties to the big banks, and what they aren't talking about could seriously hurt American democracy. If you listen closely to the sales pitch being used to sell the TPP to the American public, you'll notice that it is nearly identical to the pitches that Clinton used for NAFTA. And just like NAFTA, you shouldn't believe that the TPP will be a cure-all for the American economy. And we'll hear from Mike Papantonio about the biggest news from progressive media that you need to know about. We have all that and more coming up, but right now, you've stepped into the Ring of Fire.
You can't change Washington from the inside. You can only change it from the outside.
Grand jury secrecy rules.
For political gain.
The press can find out.
That has nothing to do with politics, but go ahead.
It wouldn't bother me.
Oops.
In the 1990s, Americans were promised a future with better wages, more jobs, and greater freedom in purchasing products and hiring workers. That future, we were told, would be made possible by a little piece of legislation known as NAFTA. The reality of NAFTA is far different than the rosy picture painted for us by the Clinton administration, and we've seen a decline in worker protections, hundreds of thousands of jobs shipped out of the country, and stagnant wages. But still today, you can hear those exact same talking points being thrown around by the Obama administration as they try to sell us the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And I have Howard Nations with me now to tell us why we shouldn't believe a word that they say. Howard, I'm sure you remember, you follow politics very closely, always have. Back in the 1990s, we're told, listen, I'm Bill Clinton, I've got this plan, it's called NAFTA. All these economic problems we're having, just listen to me, just trust me. NAFTA is going to solve them all. And today, we're hearing the same thing from Barack Obama, aren't we?
We surely are. We didn't learn the lessons of the past because NAFTA promised jobs and prosperity for everyone. And the truth of the matter is that the job market in America was greatly reduced. They killed U.S. jobs. Workers in America lost bargaining power. They've had pay cuts, benefit cuts, and income inequality has gone up as corporations got richer and richer. And now President Obama is selling the Trans-Pacific Partnership with the same promises that Bill Clinton made in the early 90s. It's interesting that Obama, when he was candidate Obama, he said that NAFTA was a mistake that was negotiated by corporate lobbyists and that it needed to be renegotiated. But the history of corporate lobbyists and presidents writing pro-corporate trade agreements is repeating itself.
It is. And, the renegotiation part that candidate Obama had said would have been phenomenal, because right now what we have is corporations are allowed to go into North America, say an American company can go to Mexico, and the NAFTA allows that company to trump the laws of the country. A great example, Exxon up in Canada a few years back, they wanted to do some offshore drilling in an area where the Canadian government had deemed you cannot do offshore drilling. Exxon challenges this under NAFTA and wins and begins their offshore drilling. The will of the company trumps the country's laws, and that's exactly what NAFTA brought us. And this is only a few countries involved in NAFTA. The Trans-Pacific Partnership is going to be a much larger coalition of, you can't even call them countries, they're companies. Companies want this. The countries, the companies are pulling the strings here, and most of this, what we know of the TPP, has come from document leaks, not because President Obama or anybody in the administration or Congress has stepped forward and said, okay, I just want to update you and say this is what it's going to do. No, we have to find out through leaks, because they know that if the American public were to understand fully what is going to happen to them under the TPP, they would not get a single person out there to support it.
That's true. If you look at what happened under NAFTA, we had 1 million net jobs lost in the United States. You had higher income inequality, and listen, $181 billion U.S. trade deficit just between us, Mexico, and Canada, and the doubling of immigration from Mexico into the United States. And it's the same story back then. It was corporate lies. You may recall General Electric, Chrysler particularly, and Caterpillar. They promised that if you pass NAFTA, we'll create a specific number of jobs in the United States. Instead, what they did once they got NAFTA passed, they fired workers in the United States and moved their operations to Mexico. You would think that would have helped the Mexican workers, but the fact of the matter is, in a recent survey, they showed that Mexican poverty rate at 52.3% is the same now as it was pre-NAFTA, 1994, and their real wages are the same. Their unemployment is significantly increased. So the whole thing was a complete failure on both sides of the border for everybody except corporations. So the whole TPP, everything is corporate driven.
Well, you know, and that's a great point to bring up, is the fact that we do have a lot of Americans who say, oh, well, you know, they're sending our jobs over down to Mexico. It's not helping them. They don't have the same kind of labor standards that we have here in the United States. A corporation can go down there, pay pennies on the dollar in a different currency that's already, you know, less valuable than the dollar. They save tons of money. It doesn't help anyone in Mexico. Yeah, it might create a few jobs, but they're jobs that aren't enough to support a family, to support a worker. And so with the TPP, we're looking at doing that, you know, all across the Pacific. And, you know, I think a big point of this is the fact that people aren't necessarily learning from the mistakes of the past. You know, Obama is out there using, you know, verbatim the exact talking points that Clinton used back in 1994, 93 and 94. Dave Johnson with the Campaign for America's Future really took the time and he laid out everything Clinton said, compared it to everything Obama said, and you almost can't tell the two apart right now, can you?
Yeah, you know, you're right. It's not that we don't learn from the mistakes of the past. It is that corporate America has learned from the successes of the past. Clinton's promises that you're talking about were that they didn't work out. Jobs making cars, electronics, apparel, everything having to do with manufacturing left the Midwest and moved to Mexico. Mexico alone eliminated 692 net U.S. jobs. But the fact of the matter is that we don't know yet because we haven't seen what the TPP looks like, but you can bet it's going to be improved upon from the viewpoint of the corporation. They're making the same promises today that Obama and the corporate lobbyists about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. They're saying it'll increase jobs, it'll increase exports. They don't bother to tell you that the imports will exceed exports. They're creating huge trade deficits. And Obama says that we need to get American products sold overseas, and that I like the one about half of the manufacturing executives are looking at bringing their jobs back from China. Yeah, they're looking at bringing them from China to Vietnam, where the average income is less than, for the worker, is less than $1 per hour.
The Center for Economic Policy Research, they've done the math on this, and they say that if TPP were put into place now, by the year 2025, we're looking at 0.13% GDP growth as a result of the TPP. Now, 0.13%, when you're talking about huge numbers, you know what? It's a gain. But we can get much larger growth by doing simple things like raising the minimum wage, by closing corporate tax loopholes, by repealing subsidies for an oil industry that already brings in $40 billion, you know, per company per year. So why on earth would we want to get such a minimal gain in real GDP growth when we could do any number of policies that would not only help American citizens, but help American businesses and help the economy? I don't understand. We've got about a minute left. Help me understand why we want to go to such extreme lengths when we could enact these policies that would help everyone.
I can answer that for you in 2 words: corporate profit. That's what it's all about. This is scary. public citizen, you were talking about the study by the Center for Economic and Policy Research. They, along with public citizen, say that 90% of U.S. workers will take a pay cut if TPP is passed, because the TPP, there will be a wage loss for all but the richest 10%. So that means if you're making $87,000 per year or less, the TPP will mean a wage loss for you. It'll also cause a second Mexican migration, because Mexican jobs are going to move to Vietnam. And so the whole idea that this thing is being done in secret has very good reasoning behind it. The congressional staff can't see TPP. There's no analysis by Congress. It's being put on a fast track with 90 days to debate it for an up or down vote. No time for the press to review it. So if TPP is so good for America, why is it being kept secret? They're pushing it through fast track. And why is it just an up or down vote instead of debate and amendment and the way we usually do business in America? Corporate profit is the answer to your question, Farron.
And, you know, President Obama has stood firmly behind the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He's all for it. And I don't know that in the little bit of time he has left in office that he's going to be able to push it through. But I can make a promise that if we end up with a Hillary Clinton or anybody who calls themselves a Republican in the White House after 2016, this thing is going to become a reality, and it's going to be a disaster. Howard, I appreciate you telling us this story. Stay on it. We will keep covering this until it finally goes away.
By the way, Farron, one last question. Whatever happened to candidate Obama?
I would love to see candidate Obama again. I thought at the beginning of this year he was talking a little bit more tough on things like the Keystone XL pipeline, but behind closed doors, he really is just the same milquetoast, you know, Democrat in name only. Let's do what we can to help corporations president, and this country doesn't need any more of that at all. Thank you, Howard.
Thanks, Farron.
Those of us who follow the activities of the Attorney General of the United States were overjoyed when current AG Eric Holder announced that he would be vacating his office as soon as a replacement could be found. But in their rush to find a replacement, the Obama administration once again turned to a corporate attorney who has plenty of experience representing Wall Street, rather than an attorney that has spent her career fighting for average citizens. Remarkably, the progressive movement has remained almost completely silent about Obama's nominee, Loretta Lynch, and I'm joined now by David Hersh to tell us why we need to be very wary of Lynch's nomination. David, this article shows up the other day online by Yves Smith, Naked Capitalism, asking the very good question of why we're not hearing more outrage from the progressive community, specifically about one aspect of Attorney General nominee Loretta Lynch's past. But the bigger question is, why are we not getting progressive outrage about all of Loretta Lynch's past? I mean, this is the woman that is most likely going to succeed Eric Holder, who is one of the most corporate bank-friendly attorney generals we've seen in a very long time. And so why is nobody talking about the fact that Loretta Lynch is a carbon copy of Eric Holder?
Well, you know, Farron, it's a very discouraging set of developments, because Loretta Lynch, as you know, as the U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of New York, was responsible for dealing with HSBC, one of the largest global banks, in addressing issues that frankly go to the core of what our government ought to be doing to protect U.S. citizens, which is they were providing tax shelters, they were hiding funds, and they were providing tax evasion services for Mexican drug cartels. And in her capacity as the U.S. Attorney in New York, Ms. Lynch gave him a relative slap on the wrist, but more importantly, failed to let anyone know that the government was also aware, and had been aware since 2010, that HSBC has engaged in a pattern and practice of helping high net worth individuals evade their taxes. They've had the information that was provided by the French government. We have a whistleblower from the inside who has given names and dates and amounts and all the detail that would be needed. And so the real question is, when are we going to ask Ms. Lynch the really difficult questions, which is, why are we not prosecuting bank officers? Why are we not bringing enforcement actions? Why are we not holding them accountable for tax evasion and aiding and abetting tax evasion? That's what is required in this position. And yeah, she's going to follow along, it appears, in the footsteps of Holder, and it's discouraging that the Senate Judiciary Committee on Thursday of last week approved her without really getting to the bottom of any of this pile of stinking manure that has been spread about. And it's very concerning.
Well, you know, this HSBC scam that you're talking about, this is full-blown. This is mob. We talked about this on the show a couple weeks ago. This really is mob behavior. This is what you see in old gangster movies. You know, we're going to help smuggle the drugs. We're going to help you hide your money offshore. Don't worry about it. This is what this bank was doing, and she knew they were doing it. We have documents showing they did it. They helped Mexican drug cartels to buy a plane specifically for the purposes of smuggling cocaine. HSBC employees did that. And she still says, okay, you know what? Here's what we're going to do. We're going to give you a small little fine. Of that fine, when big banks or big corporations end up getting slapped with a fine by a U.S. attorney, they usually end up paying about 25% of the total. That's it. And of that, they're able to write off, I believe, anywhere between 10 and 15% of that total. So total, whenever you see one of these big banking fines, go ahead and drop it down to 10% of the total, because that's usually what they end up paying. And to somebody like Loretta Lynch, that's just fine.
Right. And then the additional problem that goes with that, Farron, is that at the time this deal was struck in 2012, this slap on the wrist that you talk about, that ends up being pennies on the dollar to HSBC. At the time that deal was struck by Ms. Lynch, she was fully aware, and the government had had for over 2 years a complete dossier on additional tax evasion, tax fraud, direct activities by HSBC and their senior management, their wealth advisors, helping high net worth individuals avoid taxes and defraud the government, and nothing was said about it. It should have been in the report. It should have been publicly made aware. It should have been part of the high-profile prosecution. But instead, all of this gets swept under the rug. And then more concerning than anything, when it comes time for the Democrats in the Judiciary Committee to stand up and say, wait a minute, we need to hold these big corporate raiders accountable. We need to hold the HSBCs of the world accountable. And Ms. Lynch, why didn't you do that? Instead, they voted along party line and simply tried to push the nomination through. They voted with three Republicans to get it through, so that now she's going to the full Senate. She's going to end up being our Attorney General, and there's never going to be accountability or a public accounting for what's been done and why it's been done. And I think, frankly, we owe it to the U.S. people to have a full dialogue, full disclosure, full explanation. Let's shed the light of day on this so the folks on the street can know what's going on.
Well, you know, even before the HSBC, I guess, criminal activity that she decided wasn't a big deal, even before that story broke, you know, here at Ring of Fire, we've been talking about it for months. The fact that this woman's history alone tells us that she should not be trusted as the U.S. Attorney General. She comes from the law firm of Covington Burling, which exact same law firm as Eric Holder, corporate law firm, handles lawsuits against big banks. You know, they go in there and they defend the banks. They sit next to the bankers in court and say, listen, what my client did wasn't illegal. This is a good guy. This is a good family man. Don't worry about him. Nobody got hurt. I mean, that's what they do. That's how they make their money. They sit in court next to these people every day and defend this criminal activity. And then after she leaves Covington Burling, she goes and sits on the Federal Reserve Bank of New York City. So she went from defending the banks to literally working in a bank. This is a big bank woman at a time when big banks are the biggest criminals in the United States. I don't understand how, this HSBC story, it's pretty damning for her, but we have all this information before we even heard this that should have we shouldn't even be talking about her today, because 4 months ago, when we knew all this other information, it should have squashed this nomination.
And this nomination and the facts about Ms. Lynch need to see the light of day. It's critical, before there's a full Senate vote on her, that the people of the United States understand exactly as you say, Farron, what her background is, the fact that she has spent time defending criminals and wrongdoers. Then in her position as U.S. Attorney, she's been soft on these criminal wrongdoers. Now she's going to be in a position where she's the Chief Enforcement Officer for the U.S. This needs to see the light of day. People need to understand before there's a full vote. It's something that can't continue to be swept under the rug.
Well, and one of the things that does come up a lot is, she's been really great on racial issues, on social justice issues. She's been great as an attorney general for that. And that is true. I'm not going to say that she doesn't have a good record with that. But that's not everything. That's not everything. We have to also address the negatives that this woman has, and her negatives by far outweigh any positive, I think, that she could bring to the table here. And just about 45 seconds left. What do you think? Is there any ideal candidate out there that you would like to see as Attorney General, or qualities you want to see?
I don't have any political agenda to promote here and ideal candidates, but I do think that the person who's going to sit as the chief law enforcement officer for the United States needs to be a person who has the goals and the values of our democracy in place and in practice. It needs to be someone who's willing to hold the politically savvy and those that have political clout accountable when they commit crimes. And so they can't be someone who's beholden to the big banks. It can't be someone who's afraid of the big banks or the big corporations. It's got to be someone who's willing to stand up even against those who are powerful, multinational, and very wealthy, to say what's right and what's wrong. And someone who's willing to stand up in the light of day and have their record examined in broad daylight so that everyone knows.
And we already have corporations in control of the Supreme Court. The last thing we need is for them to also control the Attorney General.
You bet.
David Hersh, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Farron.
Earlier this week, Mike Papantonio and Sam Cedar sat down to discuss the biggest news of the week for Ring of Fire Radio. Everything from the absurdity of our drug laws to the ongoing decline of Republican intellectualism. Let's take a look.
So, Pap, this week, on Tuesday of this week, small amounts of marijuana, both smoking, growing, and owning them, became legal in Alaska. This is the third state. Now, it's not as broad as we've seen in Washington and Colorado, but this is anyone aged 21 or older can possess up to an ounce of marijuana and grow up to 6 marijuana plants. And really, in many respects, I mean, this is where we're headed in this country, and it's long overdue.
Yeah, there's a lot of parts to this story. I think this is an important story on a lot of different levels. One is just the social aspects behind everything. But as you look at this story, I think it's important. 23 states have passed those comprehensive medical marijuana laws. Interesting, though, Sam, none of them are in the South. Georgia, Kentucky, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina. They all are toying with the idea of medical research marijuana. But what's happened is the industry, the Pfizer, Merck pharmaceutical industry has done such an incredible job making it impossible to even do research on what is happening with marijuana. We find out now, for example, one thing they're doing, and this is so insidious. But you have like the organization, maybe let's say Drug-Free Kids. Well, that particular group is paid for by Purdue Pharmacy. Now, what does Drug-Free Kids do? Drug-Free Kids gets out there every time there's any effort to try to legalize even medical marijuana. You have them out on the front lines trying to defeat it. You don't know that they're being paid for by the prescription drug industry, but they are. And so then what they do, Sam, is they recruit the Sheriff's Association. They use their influence in lobbying with them. That association opposes any amendment fights. But the real story here is a lot of these things are just front organizations, and they look like they're legitimate. But the drug industry, the pharmaceutical drug industry, has simply set it up, and we don't even get a chance to do research on what the possibilities are here.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And look, there's been there's been some. I mean, there was a new report out by the journal Scientific Reports finds that marijuana far safer than other recreational drugs, especially and including alcohol. And like you say, this is well overdue. But when you want to know, I mean, look, there's two aspects as to why it's been so slow, this prohibition in terms of being repealed. One is that there has been just sort of a general societal nervousness over this that I think is just dissipated. But you're right. The other part of this is that much of that nervousness has been driven by major pharmaceutical players who see the legalization and, whether it's medical marijuana or just a full decriminalization or full legalization scheme as a direct threat to their profits.
And that's why the Department of Justice has not gotten involved with trying to help the Department of Justice works for the Pfizers. They work for Merck's. They're their boy. They go forward with this war on marijuana, even though they know that 60,000 individuals are put behind bars for marijuana offenses every year, and it costs taxpayers about $1.2 billion per year. And that the marijuana violations, 90% of them, Sam, are simply possession. And if you take a look at all of the police arrests across America every year, there are on marijuana charges, the number of charges on marijuana exceeds all violent crimes combined: murder, rape, aggravated assault, battery. How does this happen? It happens because you have so much money being pumped into it by the drug industry, by the Purdue Pharmacy, by the Merck's, and they're doing it under all of these fronts. And it's just an ugly story that the other side of the story is not being told enough.
Yeah, and I think you make a good point too in that this is driving a lot of industries. It's driving the private prison industrial complex, as well as this prohibition is helping the drug manufacturers. But I mean, the bottom line is this is, in my estimation, this is an issue that I think, we're going to see more and more movement on. We've got, like we just said, we now have 3 states where marijuana is, to some degree or another, fully legalized. And the nightmare scenarios that we were promised have not materialized at all.
No,
and,
as a matter of fact, you look at the other side of it, this is where it's really crazy. 84% of all of the prescribed painkillers in the world, 84% are prescribed in America. Now, how does that? It happens in a way that first of all, we have to ignore the fact that death from painkillers just exceeds all the deaths from heroin and cocaine combined. And not to mention, there are no known deaths from marijuana aside from impaired driving. Somebody doesn't overdose on marijuana and die. But there's another part to this story that I don't know if we can do in this segment we really ought to pick up on, and that is that whether or not the way to approach it is with this Charlotte's Web that's being used down in Florida, that it gives us time to at least begin studying it in a more open way to where we find out, we know Charlotte's Web, for example, is a way to treat children who are having 50 to 60 grand mal seizures a day from epilepsy, it treats them to where those seizures virtually disappear, and it's reduced to 1 or 2, and most of the time that takes place in night while they're sleeping. So there's a lot of good inroads, but in order to do that, the state has to do at least what Florida has done and open the door, at least crack the door so where further research can be done and people can benefit from, whether it's MS or Parkinson's disease, cancer, they can benefit from what this marijuana has to offer, even if it's a low THC and a high CBD. I mean, the point is there are a lot of benefits here, and we're not taking advantage of it.
I think there's a huge fear on the part of the pharmaceutical industry that there's going to be a low-cost, fairly accessible form of treatment that is far more effective than the chemicals that they begin to create. And you had mentioned something earlier about Charlotte's Web. I'm not familiar with what that is.
This is a great story, because this is a story about why you have to expand at least the right to begin in a narrow way, and then expand the research on it. Charlotte's Web is a legislation that was passed in Florida, and it was passed because a child who was suffering from epilepsy was having about 300 grand mal seizures a month. And so what ended up happening was they discovered that there was some research done out in Colorado by the Stanley brothers that they're brilliant. They've engineered the ways that marijuana oil can be used, and what they did is they lowered the THC, increased the CBD, which is the beneficial part for epilepsy and some other illnesses. And so the legislature, against all odds, I might tell you, just unanimously passed Charlotte's Web. And then this child, they named it after this child because she went out to Colorado and was treated by the product that the Stanley brothers had developed. It was a cannabis oil that she took twice a day with her food, and she's thriving now. I mean, she is 7 or 8 years old. Her seizures only happen 2 to 3 times per month. And usually it's in her sleep. She's able to walk. She rides her bicycle. Her brain is making connections that haven't been made in years because of her epilepsy. So we know there's a direct connection here. There's no question about it, and the legislature figured that out. Now, the real issue, and I think this is more myth than anything, at least I hope it is, but the myth is that the folks that want an amendment, a full amendment fight, for legalized medical marijuana are somehow trying to tamper with the movement forward of Charlotte's Web. I don't think that's correct, but that's out there, and it would be awful if it was. I mean, it would be you talk about a policy disaster for the amendment fight, folks. It would be awful, but I don't think it's really happening. But, I mean, to say it's happening, you would have to say, well, money trumps the lives of these children who can be treated with Charlotte's Web. But the point is this. The only reason I raise that is because there are a lot of thresholds that you have to get past when it comes to legalizing marijuana, medical marijuana even in your state. One is, as you pointed out, the pharmaceutical industry pumps billions of dollars into stopping it with front companies like Drug-Free Kids. The second part is, you understand, the prison industry, the law enforcement industry makes a lot of money in this process. Understand that 60,000 individuals are in prison right now for marijuana offenses. 90% of them are possession-only offenses. So with privatized jails, privatized prison, that's another factor of the money fight that's going on, that's behind there in the drug story. But the point is this: in the South, there is not one state that has legalized marijuana. It's a tough road down here because you have these front groups like Drug-Free Kids and several others that get the police departments and the sheriff's departments behind them and try to make it look like this is going to be the invitation to organized crime.
Well, I'll tell you something. It reminds me of another story that we see in the context of climate change that came out this week. There is a well-known climate denial a scientist, I put that in quotes, named Wei Hak Soon, who apparently has accepted more than $1.2 million from the fossil fuel industry to essentially deliver papers arguing that global climate change is a function of the sun just being extra hot, essentially. And I mention that only in this context is that, this is a standard thing we see from these huge industries. They will do anything to make sure there's no competition to their product. I mean, on some level, when we contemplate what business is, people think, businesses go out there, they just make the best product. But when you've got the amount of money and the market share that these companies have and these industry has, they're going to fight things like sustainable energy, or they're going to fight things like a strain of marijuana that doesn't necessarily get you high, but can prevent something like grand mal seizures. I mean, that is something that we've seen from industry time and time again. So in some ways, it shouldn't shock people, but in other ways, we're talking about, this.
Well, they hire
like this girl.
They hire biostitutes. The guy you're talking about from that Harvard group, he's a biostitute. I mean, he could be hired for anything because he's not really a scientist. He's a whore. And so what the science whore does is says, well, how much can you pay me? And I'll say whatever you want to say. That also happens within the legalization of marijuana. You see these paid freaks show up in the fight that took place in Amendment 2 down in Florida. They had every reason to pass that, except every now and then you would have these scientific whores come out and say things like they knew weren't true. They can be hired cheaply now in the university systems.
So, Pap, this week we continue to see the incredibly, the meltdown of a couple of right-wing icons. One who has been associated with the base, I guess, of the Republican Party, and another who was touted just, 6 or 7 years ago as the moderate wing of the Republican Party, who has completely gone off the deep end. And frankly, from my perspective, there's nothing terribly surprising about Rudy Giuliani's comments and his continued double down on this. The only thing that's surprising to me is that there's been so many people in the media who, for the first time, are starting to realize that Rudy Giuliani is nothing more than Donald Trump, who actually served as mayor of this city.
To lay the story out, people get bits and pieces of how crazy the guy's gone, but to me, it's the image of this old, washed-up, has-been politician that is just helping himself melt down the very last parts of his relevance. I mean, I don't know.
I think so. And God bless, frankly, if this finally is the last straw that gets him off the national scene. But Rudy Giuliani, about a week and a half ago, basically went on television and said, I hate to say this, which is the way that he always starts these things, but he didn't think that President Obama loves America. He said pointedly, I don't think he loves me. Speaking of, I imagine he loves Sam Cedar, but Rudy Giuliani said that he doesn't think that he loves Rudy Giuliani.
I think he loves Sam Cedar.
And yes, but I mean, here's the amazing thing: is that he's doubled down on this, and the interesting thing about this is not that this guy is saying anything to remain relevant. I mean, because obviously he's made millions of dollars in getting a lot of security contracts, both from the government and outside the government. This is a guy who has, cashed in on his status. He was a guy who has created this myth that somehow his policing of New York City back in the 90s was responsible for a drop in crime. We know now that is not the case. We have seen it with the reversal of his policies. There's a lot of explanations that are out there, but one that really doesn't hold up, at least when you compare it to the rate of crime, was his locking up so many people.
Sam, you grew up around all this. I mean, these are stomping grounds up there in New York, and I mean, how would you characterize the guy's anything but this this demagogue that has just built his entire career. He's built his entire image and brand around demagoguery, hasn't he?
Well, yes, and let's be honest, racism. I mean, he was out there basically saying things in the early 90s about David Dinkins, and he was out there in the early 90s basically promoting the police to get violent with people. I mean, this is a guy who did everything he could to move, to displace low-income people in this city, to really create a New York. I mean, he was the Michael Bloomberg project. It was started with Rudy Giuliani,
and so this time he says Obama's refusal to describe ISIS as Islamic terrorist and extremism is a sign that Obama hates America. I mean,
that's basically what it comes down to.
Yeah.
And so Giuliani, at least I think, has now been seen for the lunatic that he is. This is a guy who was just had a very sort of nasty past when it came to his family matters, which generally don't interest me that much. But if you're going to go on television and say that Barack Obama doesn't love America, if you're going to sort of try and discern what does
love mean?
Yeah, exactly. You should clean up your own house.
Well,
and this is a guy who's had very questionable ethics across the board.
It's amazing to me he stayed out of prison, to tell you the truth. I mean, cut it down to really its real issue. I mean, if you look at his channeling in through the New York politics, you go, my God. But hey, how about this? How about the Bill O'Reilly story? I mean, to me, talk about another kind of washed up old guy who's just, if he keep his mouth shut, he could finish his career in kind of an honorable kind of way. But he takes the Brian Williams story and makes it look like it's nothing. I mean, when he comes out, and this story about him, that he was in Argentina. He had to fight his way through the throngs of soldiers that were shooting people, dying in front of him in the streets, that his cameraman was hit, and he had to drag his bloody cameraman to safety, and that they were staring him down on M16 or something akin to that, and he had to talk his way out of it because he was a seasoned war correspondent. And then the people that were there with him says, not only is that insane, but the guy is totally cuckoo. And he's always been cuckoo. That is not true. And then what ends up happening is, to me, what I love about this story is O'Reilly then says to CBS, release the films. The films are going to show I'm telling the truth. And the films verify that he is a fraudulent liar, that all of this is crazy, that there's no discussion about any cameraman being bloodied up and him dragging him to safety. What is your take on this guy? I mean, why does he just shut up and finish his career with a little bit of dignity?
Well, I would disagree. I would take issue with the fact that he has a little bit of dignity. I mean, look, we remember this is the guy who was talking about bringing falafel into the shower to sexually harass his producers. This is the guy who was caught lying by our former colleague, now Senator Al Franken. You remember that exchange they had on that dais?
Yeah.
Run that real
quick. Run down that real quick. That does tell you the story.
Well, he claimed that that while he was the host of a low-rent sort of tabloid entertainment show, that they had won 2 Peabody Awards, and he claimed it over and over again, and Al Franken caught him in a lie, when in fact that show had won sort of a low-end Polk Award, and it wasn't even happened when O'Reilly was the host. I mean, there's been a series of these things with O'Reilly, and none of it sticks because his audience doesn't care. I mean, that's what's so interesting about juxtaposing these stories. On one hand, Rudy Giuliani, completely irrelevant. However, this is going to hurt the Republicans more because he's supposedly one of their moderate stalwarts, and it just raises this issue of their racial problems. And the irony is that Rudy Giuliani is a guy who's been out of politics. Well, I guess the last time he ran for president was in 2008, and he dropped out quite quickly. But in many respects, I think Rudy Giuliani is doing more damage to the Republican brand than Bill O'Reilly is, because I don't think Bill O'Reilly was taken that seriously by anybody except for his audience, and they don't care that he lies because nobody would be watching him if they cared about whether or not you could trust what he says, because he's been shown to be sort of serially lying years over years. But Rudy Giuliani has been, I mean, people were talking about this guy like he was the moderate paragon of the Republican Party, and it becomes clear the guy is just a full-on racist.
Okay, look, here, look, both of them are equally awful and disgusting, and it's just it makes you want to gag when you hear the stories. But to me, the Bill O'Reilly story, I guess the most agonizing thing to me is you hit it. His people really don't care. Roger Ailes doesn't care because he is he realizes that Bill O'Reilly is a caricature of fraud. That's what he is. But in this situation, when you have the people that worked with you, that were there at CBS, they were there in 82 in the Falklands. They were there when, with O'Reilly, when O'Reilly was lying about the fact that he had to fight back combat troops and save his cameraman, that people were being shot down in the streets in front of him. At some point, don't you say, how frigging stupid is the audience that listens to him? I mean, are they really so stupid where they say, this doesn't matter? This doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And then you have him calling out the New York Times and saying, you'll see when the CBS films are released that they're going to be vindicating me. And they're just the opposite. They make him look like more of a liar. And then he says to the reporter of the New York Times, if you don't handle this right, I'm coming after you. I mean, what has happened to this guy's head? I mean, look. You've seen. I don't know if you saw the old film when he was a young reporter, relatively young, and he just goes off on the set, rips his jacket off, throws it on the table, screams at his producer, screams at the cameraman because they missed a word in the teleprompter. And you're going, this has always been him, but now it's worse because he has money, because he has people that listen to him. And I don't think he ever goes away. This kind of story doesn't make him go away. He's too much.
No, not at all. And frankly, I think it is, and in many respects, Pap, and I know there's a lot of listeners who sometimes say, like, why talk about this stuff?
Yeah,
well,
it's important to talk about.
It's very important. And the bottom line is, back in 2004, when we both started at Air America, there was nobody talking about this stuff. And when Bill O'Reilly said something, that it actually ended up in the mainstream media. It went across the corporate media. And largely because of what we do here and what places like Media Matters does, and what we used to see on occasion on MSNBC, which cranked up, in the years following us at Air America, and what Al Franken did when he wrote that book was exposing this stuff and embarrassing these people and showing that they're not credible, so that if someone was to quote them in the corporate media, they would pay a price. Exactly. And so we don't see them filtering this stuff. And that's why this stuff about Rudy Giuliani is so important, because to finally put a stake in the heart of this guy's credibility so that it is undeniable to the corporate media, so that we no longer have to hear Rudy Giuliani pontificate about stuff and the mainstream media does not take him seriously anymore. This is a net win for people who want some type of credible news out there. I mean, it's a small one, but it's a net.
Let me throw another side at it. Here you have Bill O'Reilly that says to his viewers, now realize that, you're dealing with IQ of about room temperature. I get that. We understand that. But he says to his viewers as they're drooling, watching whatever time he comes on, he says to them, watch this film. Watch the CBS film footage, and you're going to see that everything that I've said is everything is accurate in what I reported about me being this brave reporter who saved who saved his cameraman and was, being shot at. And it's all, so he shows it to them, and they say, oh, yeah, I see it. Yeah, this does answer what you're saying is being true. And you're looking at the film, you say, really? What if anything, it disproves everything the guy says.
Yep.
But he still has these, 1.5 million, 2 million people out there that are just so stretched on intellect that they listen to it and they go, oh, wow, I guess he was telling the truth.
But the upside of this, Pap, is that regardless of his audience as it still exists, regardless of the fact that Rudy Giuliani can go and get his speaking fees from whatever corporate or right-wing, sort of festival that's taking place, the bottom line, the important thing for the rest of us, I think, is that, and maybe Bill O'Reilly nobody took seriously anymore anyways, but at the very least, we've knocked Rudy Giuliani out of the box. And
you think so? I mean, you think it's real? Well, I
really don't think that, that I think he's become so toxic now that we're no longer going to hear him pontificate. I mean, remember when Chris Christie was, and he's still obviously mired in multiple investigations, federal and state investigations. Chris Christie not out of the woods, but people went to talk to Rudy Giuliani and got his opinion on it. I think that's over. I think that Rudy Giuliani is now relegated to Fox and Friends and all those ridiculous shows over there. And I think that's a good thing for the rest of us, because we no longer have this guy's toxic perspective, which was always a function of what was going to put money in his pocket. It's no longer respected. It is now perceived as toxic in those corporate media circles. And that, I think, is a very good thing, frankly, for the country.
Yes.
And we've got some important things happening when we got, things like national security, like Iran coming up, this potential deal or Department of Homeland Security funding. And to not have Rudy's voice taken seriously, I think, is a huge plus for all of us, Pap.
Well,
we got just 30 seconds.
Yeah, but I mean, we'll see. I think the guys, he does. You're right. He is relegated to Fox and Friends, and that is the case. I don't know that it's over for him because we do realize that there's part of that conservative mentality. It's just the way their brain works. It is like, they come up with an opinion. I like this guy, therefore I can't ever criticize him. Very different from me and you, for example. We liked Obama. We still like things about him, but we criticize the hell out of him when he messes up. They can't do that. It's a brain dysfunction of some kind.
That's it for this week's Ring of Fire, but you can keep up with us throughout the week online at ringoffireradio.com, on Twitter at Ring of Fire Radio, and on Facebook. I'm Farron Cousins, and we'll see you next week right here on Ring of Fire.